industry studies and assessing pesticides for, well, my entire working life. When I retired, I was already somewhat perturbed by the very quick rise in the use of neonics, given a lot of the warning flags that had been put up earlier by EPA and others. And I proceeded to counsel some new researchers that they should have a look at that class of chemicals, and kept a foot in it myself by working with several environmental groups to keep abreast of the literature and produce a number of reports, which you see here, and as well as peer-reviewed publications. I actually like reports in the sense that it allows you to expand on the very increasing amount of information that is out there. It allows you to really look at all of the arguments and thoroughly review them. So all of those reports that I've done for various organizations that I thank here for their support, not only the Bird Conservancy, but the Center for Food Safety, Friends of the Earth, Canadian Wildlife Federation, Xerces, NRDC, have all sort of turned to me over the years to assess the literature and advise them about the diversity index. And we're here specifically to talk about that last report that just came out a few weeks ago. Okay, again, there we go. All right, so going back to the basics, key aspect of neonics. I spent most of my working career looking at organophosphorus and carbamate insecticides, which were sort of precursors of neonics. But one of the main features of neonics is their systemic activity. Not a new concept, rather. There have been systemic pesticides and insecticides for as long as there were pesticides, but it's especially well developed in neonics. And by systemic means that the material can be absorbed in the root or the foliage and translocated to other parts of the plant. Now, the initial issue that came up with that was the impact on pollinators, because the residues also make their way into pollen and nectar. Now, it's estimated that in some cases, only up to 5% of the material actually makes it into the plant. And the rest of the material is washed off or is already in the soil if it was a soil application or seed treatment, and is then available for broader distribution in the environment. That could be to birds, so certainly for seed treatments, which we'll be talking about. It could be into water, both some surface runoff and groundwater, and of course pollinators being exposed throughout, because the one thing you can't do very well with neonics is time your applications and try to set them up so as to spare pollinators. There's literature that shows that in some orchard trees you can get residues in pollen and nectar higher a year after the application. So it becomes a constant source of exposure for not just pollinators, but other insects as well. So in 2013, as Hardy mentioned, we laid out our case saying, hey, let's have a good look at neonics, because it's more than pollinators, which really at the time was the only thing that people were worried about. It does have a high toxicity to a broad range of non-targets, and that includes birds. They're extremely persistent. They do persist and accumulate in soil. They're photodegraded, but in soil they're quite persistent. They're also very mobile. They're very water soluble, and as I mentioned, that makes them susceptible to runoff and movement to groundwater infiltration. As a result, not surprisingly, there's increasing evidence that there's a broad contamination of aquatic systems with these classes of compounds. We believed in 2013, as we do now, that the assessment from most regulators, notably in North America, was inadequate and poorly done, and that the risks were grossly underestimated. The thing that really got my antennae vibrating, in 2013 was the fact that they were being pushed as prophylactic treatments for all of the major field crops. So you were hard pressed to find a single crop in a single acre of cropland that did not receive one or several neonics. From a regulator's point of view, of course, it was really the sort of the siren song and for them, because they were desperately trying to get rid of organophosphorus and carbamate insecticides, and they embraced these new compounds willy-nilly, and they went from being a sort of a specialty insecticide on potatoes and a few other crops to being used, as I said, on everything. And it's a truism in the pesticide world that the extent of environmental damage that you will have with any molecule, really, because pesticide has the word "side" in it, which means to kill. They're meant to kill something somewhere. And so the overall extent of the environmental damage really has to do with the breadth of activity, which in this case is wide, and the popularity or the use of the product, which again, in this case, is very wide also. So the new report does not specifically deal with the issue of pollinators. I would sort of send you to a previous report, notably on California and seed treatments, which goes into that in greater depth. The thing is that even though it's always called the pollinators, or that we're protecting pollinators, the pollinator here is a stand-in for insects writ large. And whether it's beneficial insects, useful from a crop point of view, and bird food. So, and the pollinator assessment, which in this case was done by all three North American regulatory bodies: PMRA from Canada, Cal EPA, and US EPA, and the EPA still relies on that assessment as late as their recent efforts to look at endangered species. And I believe that that assessment is also fatally flawed. The only endpoint is the survival of honeybee hives. Doesn't consider the hundreds of solitary bee species and other insects, of course. The assessment itself is very biased in the way it calculates likely residues in pollen and nectar. It ignores the impact of seed treatments, and specifically the dust that is generated at the time of seed treatment, and that is responsible for much of the direct mortality that beekeepers were seeing. So obviously to insects at large as well. It ignores contaminated water as a source of exposure, which we know can be very important in the case of bees, guttation fluids, as well as water on the soil surface. It ignores the fact that there's a lot of drift and contamination from runoff off-site. So a lot of the time, there's a distinction made between crops that are attractive to pollinators and those that are not. And in fact, that distinction is not very helpful in an ecological context, because a lot of residues move off the field into the surrounding area. Anyway, it could go on. The assessment ignores a lot of peer-reviewed literature in favor of industry studies, and ignores a lot of growing data, field data, that shows that there is an impact on butterflies and others on the landscape scale. Oh, and just last little bit too, and of course something that the people looking at bee impacts have been saying for a long time is that it's not just about mortality. There's evidence that neonics can affect a lot of learning, memory, other processes in insects. And looking back on it, even Bayer, the manufacturer of some of the neonics, was actually touting that as an advantage of imidacloprid. when it came to control of termites. And it says here in some of their own advertising, it causes termites to cease their natural grooming behavior when they stop. They're attacked by fungi. So it makes fungi 10,000 times more dangerous to termites. So works great for termites, but that information is not taken into account when it comes to assessing bees or other insects. Birds can also be affected directly. So EPA, in their latest assessments, persist in underestimating the toxicity to birds, and I steer you to the report to get the details on this. But the simple fact is, if you start with a couple of toxicity data points, even if you take the lowest of those two, it doesn't mean that that particular endpoint or that particular value will protect or is protective of the hundreds of potential bird species that will be exposed. And yet that is how we conduct risk assessments at EPA in 2023. We get two values, we take the lowest one and we say, well, that should be protective enough. That's patently ridiculous. It just does not hold water, and I just don't see. They're starting to move when it comes to aquatic systems. Are starting to move to using distribution methods for coming up with better endpoints, something that we do in the report, but for some reason they refuse to do it on birds. So the standard protection is the lethal dose to half of the population, the LD50. Of course, that still only protects half of the individuals that are exposed. So inherent in the standard of protection is already mortality. And I contend that in 2023, from both a scientific, ecological, and ethical point of view, I think we can do better than that. There's a lot of evidence that birds become debilitated, seriously debilitated. I'm talking convulsions, I'm talking birds rolling around on the ground at sometimes 1/10 of the dose that will actually kill them within the predetermined test period. Is that really what we want out there in terms of environmental protection, especially when it comes to endangered species? Is it okay for them to roll around and convulse? I would think not. And when you apply a slightly more realistic standard based on the studies that we have available, you end up with conclusions that less than one corn seed in some cases can debilitate a mid-sized bird. And how is that acceptable? Why is it that none of the birds looked at by EPA actually got a jeopardy rating? Hardy mentioned the prairie chicken, but that was because of secondary effects and loss of food. To me, it just doesn't make sense at all. So there's the issue of also what I would call immediate mortality. So this is basically bird is exposed, bang, drops dead, as opposed to birds exposed, feels sick, goes into hiding, sometimes takes a day to recover, by which time its energy resources are down, its chances of survival are actually quite low, and its chances of being taken by a predator are actually quite high. So there's such a thing in my books as ecological death, and I think we need to look beyond the LD50 if you're serious about wanting to protect birds. On the exposure side, and I'll come back to seed treatments here, seed treatments have always been a problem for birds. And this starts with mercury and other heavy metal coatings at the turn of the century. The fact is, seeds in fields are highly attractive to birds and a lot of mammalian wildlife as well. So even if they get sick after ingestion of X number of seeds, which they will with neonics, and this will eventually set up some conditioned aversion where they'll say, "Oh, wait a minute, last time I ate that little red thing, I was sick as a dog." Even if that occurs, you need to have the conditions that allow the bird time to develop this condition aversion and avoid the field. I'll come back with insects later, of course, when it comes to coated insects or an insect coated with the residues, that possibility doesn't even exist. So seeds have very high loading. So on a per acre basis, it looks like, oh, well, this is quite a reduction over the rate of application of the liquid product. But that's not from a bird point of view, what you need to look at is how much is on the seed, because that is what will be consumed. The incorporation of the seeds are meant to be put under the soil surface for best germination. This is an industrial process, modern farming. They don't achieve full incorporation, and studies have shown that those spills are available routinely throughout the field. The material on spilled seed is available for a longer period of time, especially if there's no soil contact, if there's little piles. So the materials is there for a long time. And even if the material is put down properly, birds, some species anyway, will dig and scrape for seeds, eat cotyledons when the seedlings are emerging, and so on. So birds and seed treatments are really problematic. They have been for a long time. Now, we talk a lot about imidacloprid, and we could say the same from acetamiprid, because from an acute point of view, they are definitely the most toxic neonics. Once you look at the reproductive effects, then the distinction between those chemicals and the other main emerging ones, clothianidin and thiamethoxam, is not so clear. So here, for instance, for what is it, the scenario is a corn seed and a red-winged blackbird. The number of seeds per day required to cause reproductive effects are actually not that far apart. And we're talking about less than a seed a day for reproductive effects, assuming that the red-winged blackbird shows susceptibility as a reasonably sensitive individual. Now, I mentioned that seeds are not the only source of exposure. Insect-eating birds will take insects in fields that have been contaminated as a result of spray application. And here, the scenario down below here is a 20-gram songbird exposed to freshly sprayed insects. And here I used actually a very good EPA analysis on insect concentrations in fields. And kudos to them for that. That actually was a good assessment. And looking at debilitation as the endpoint, because again, we don't want all exposed birds to be convulsing in the fields. And this is the proportion of a day. So we're talking, less than 0.1, less than 1/10 of a day. So in other words, an hour of daylight feeding or so brings an insectivore into a range where it could run into trouble with imidacloprid, a little bit higher for clothianidin and thiamethoxam, but still, we're talking about a day for these compounds. We're talking a very small portion of a day for imidacloprid and acetamiprid, the two most acutely toxic ones. Oh, and something that I also, because I spent my entire working life looking at OPs and carbamates, previous insecticides, I thought, well, why not look at, let's just go back through the record and the published literature and see how does imidacloprid compare to not the most toxic. We know there were some extremely toxic, carbofuran, diazinon, and they were causing horrendous mortality in the bird world, and swallowed up a lot of my time as an assessor with the Wildlife Service. But compounds of middling average toxicity: phenylphthalate, methomyl, dimethoate, foxam, chlorpyrifos, acephate. And I went here, and so basically looking at what I call the toxic potency, which is in this case the median LD50 for these chemicals, and the rate at which they were being applied, to see that in fact at the same toxic potency as imidacloprid, we've had kills in African savannas, in forests, on cold crops. It's not it makes sense. I mean, we predict mortality, and lo and behold, chemicals that have similar toxicity, once released in the environment, do cause mortality. So to me, that's very congruent and suggests that our assessment is correct and EPA out to lunch. So that's for the direct effect on birds. Of course, as Hardy mentioned, insects are critical for the vast majority of our songbirds. And there is evidence that in both terrestrial and aquatic environments, and there's some references here, that neonics are responsible for impacts in both terrestrial and aquatic environments, driving butterfly declines in the UK, causing wild bees to go extinct near rapeseed or canola fields, and all the whole everything also on the terrestrial side. You know, there's this study that came out in 2017, which made people start talking about an insect apocalypse or Armageddon because of this massive decline in insects that we are seeing worldwide. Now, there's a number of reasons for that, but certainly in agricultural habitats, pesticides are implicated, and when it comes to insecticides, neonics have the largest share of the blame. In this case, we were able to show that the killing power of insecticides had increased 48 times over the older generation insecticides. They're you know they're very good at what they do. They're good at killing bugs, but we contend they're too good, and that type of product should not be used on every farmable acre that we have. In aquatic environments, there's also evidence now mayfly abundance is affected in stream. In Japan, there was a case of an entire smelt fishery that collapsed as a result of a mixture of neonics. Insect emergence shown to be affected near canola fields, and so on and so forth. So there's increasing amount of evidence that in the field that again is very concordant. Meanwhile, as shown by their latest endangered species estimate, the EPA continues to tinker with the laboratory data more or less as if we had no field record and the neonics were now new compounds, which they no longer are. Now, I've tracked this over the course of several reports, and it's actually quite interesting as over the years. So this is the benchmark, the chronic toxicity benchmark for imidacloprid. So this is the value that EPA puts out and says, well, we really should not exceed these levels if we want to avoid any chronic toxicity. And in my books, chronic toxicity, they also pull one out for acute toxicity, but chronic toxicity is the really only relevant one because the neonics are so long-lived that they de facto cause chronic exposure. So if you look at the chronic toxicity benchmarks over the years, they're initially assessed around 0.2 microgram. These are micrograms per liters. Then all to 1 back in 2006, while the rest of the world, Europe, Canada, was saying, oh, no, they're a lot more toxic than that. Hardy, can you see my cursor when I move it around? Yeah, okay, great. And those are the numbers that were in effect at the time of a 2013 report. And we spent a fair bit of time criticizing that value as being totally unrealistic. 2016, EPA sees the light. They say, whoa, yeah, the rest of the world is right. Chronic benchmark down to 0.01 microgram per liter. Surprise, surprise, when you do the endangered species assessment, all of a sudden it's 10 times less toxic than they said in 2016. And I know for a fact that at the time this is presented as a data quality issue, or we were a little more picky about which numbers we picked and so on. But a lot of this comes from the pressure that industry puts to bear on EPA and other regulators. So when industry sees a study that they don't like, for instance, a peer-reviewed study out of some university somewhere that shows species X to be, very, very exquisitely sensitive to their chemical, then they will get a whole bunch of hired guns to start gunning away that study. Oh, well, they didn't record this, they didn't record that. Sometimes picadillos Sometimes information that could be obtained if they only ask the researcher. But of course, publications being what they are, the level of detail that you get in a publication is not the level of detail you get in industry studies. So under the guise of using only good data and, GLP, good laboratory practice, and so on and so forth, what this does is restrict the number of data points to essentially industry studies and not much more. And that is a real problem, because the real variation is not in the slight differences that might be present in any one given study, given if the laboratory conditions were slightly different. What we know is that the real variation out there is in different species. Many orders of magnitude difference between least and most sensitive. And the real strategy here is that you use the data you've got. Assess it, sure. Don't take data that looks really bad, but you got peer-reviewed data, looks reasonable, but you can't get, the lat long of the study plot, whatever it is that you're looking for, doesn't matter. The EPA says, okay, well, that information becomes supplemental as opposed to core, but that means it's ignored in the risk assessment. It's out there, it's in the report, but ignore it. So a lot of the academic information that comes out is basically ignored for that. So I call this sort of an asymmetrical review, because of course industry is not going to send comments to EPA and start gunning at studies that show their product to be safe. So they only sort of come to life when their studies show, are critical of their product. And same with when EPA goes for and say, well, here's our assessment, and put it out for comment period. Who is going to take the time to go through a 300-page EPA assessment and go through it line by line? It's not independent researchers or university folks out there. It's people paid by the companies to do that. And of course, we know how they're going to comment. So we have a real problem here in the fairness of the data that are assessed. And there have been a number of publications about the biases that creep into industry studies, so I don't have to go into that here. So as I mentioned, contamination in aquatic bodies is very long-term and continuous. So here is one creek that's taken from our California report, Chualar Creek, which is a tributary to the Salinas River. It is an agricultural environment. And it shows over essentially an 8-year period all the sampling that was done in that particular site. Now, point 1 is the new, less protective benchmark that EPA is proposing. I believe, in fact, that it should be 10 times less than that, their 2016 number of 0.01. So regardless of which benchmark you choose, you see that, well, we have an issue out there. Now, this is imidacloprid. Most sites now have multiple residues. They have imidacloprid, clothianidin, and thiamethoxam. But that isn't considered by EPA. It's not considered relevant to look at the sum of all the neonics, when in fact, in aquatic environments, they're probably all the three big ones, imidacloprid, thiamethoxam, clothianidin, have fairly similar toxicities when there were sort of one-on-one comparisons were made. So they could very easily do combined residues, but they don't. They just take one compound at a time and say, well, it just squeaks through. If we raise the benchmark, they'll just squeeze through. But that, assumes one, that raising the benchmark was the right thing to do, which I contend it wasn't. And B, ignores the fact that there are several neonics out there. So as I mentioned, there's growing field evidence of impact. And, as early as 2014, excellent study from Holman from the Netherlands, showing a direct link between residues at the time, primarily imidacloprid. So imidacloprid was the first big neonic. It's gradually being replaced by clothianidin and thiamethoxam as through market forces. But at the time, it was primarily imidacloprid. And they looked at insectivorous birds in proximity to where water samples were taken. What I find interesting going back to that study now, 10 years later, if you look at the levels where Hullman was showing effects. So here's the 0.01, which was the original chronic benchmark proposed by EPA in 2016. I think that actually looks like this is just about right for the point of inflection of curves, which is the species, the mean species trends of all the species present on these sites. If you go to 0.1, then clearly most bird species are already being affected. So it's hard to say that the aquatic environment is being protected. That's what the benchmark is supposed to do. It's supposed to protect the aquatic environment, the receiving environment, when the consumers of that in that environment, the birds that eat the emergent insects, are already showing the strain. So to me, that harks back to the fact that, you know what, that was probably a pretty reasonable level. Other studies that have come in more recently, neonic use, and this probably associated with the direct effects and the seed treatment issue. For bobwhite in Texas, again, neonic fingered as the culprit. This really interesting study, Lee 2020, they were not able to extend their analysis to 2020 or 2019, just before they published, for the good reason that as of 2014, we no longer have any record of how much seed treatment is being sold. So the USGS had this program, and they used confidential data to assess the proportion of crops that were treated with seed treatments. In some cases, soy was 100%, corn was almost 100%, wheat probably 50 to 60%. 2014 is the last data point we have, so it's already a decade old, and we know that the use of neonics actually increased since then. Anyway, at the time, based on 2014, they modeled the information, and they modeled that neonic use specifically accounted for a 12% loss in grassland species, 5% loss in insectivorous birds where they were used. A rather strong statement. And then just very recently this year, pan-European study showing that agricultural intensification as measured by pesticide and fertilizer use is the main driver behind population declines in Europe. So this is a multi-authored, I think 20 plus authors, as many countries involved, pooling all of their bird data from all of these countries, saying, you know, it's farming. Now, not all farming is neonic, for sure, but based on the analysis that we've done, for instance, on the relative impacts of different chemicals on insects and so on, we know that neonics are a large part of the current insult, if you wish, to the natural environment. So neonics are not far behind that. Now in Europe, of course, they have banned neonics, largely for their impacts on pollinators, interestingly enough. In Canada, they were more worried about impacts to aquatic systems. In Europe, they were more worried about impacts on pollinators. In the US, they weren't worried about anything at all. And basically, where was I going with it? Europe has banned them. Maybe in 10 years' time, we'll see an uptick. But again, it depends. You know, part of it is the nature of the neonics, which is particularly troublesome because of their sort of, you know, persistence and ability to run off and toxicity. It depends on what they replace them with. If the replacement chemicals are just as toxic and just as persistent and just as likely to move, then we're not going to see much of a recovery in the bird world. So part of it, of course, is the types of chemicals that we use. Part of it is how we use them. Using it on 100% of the crop area in a prophylactic way, when the agronomic experts have said that, you know what, we probably only need it on 5 to 10% of the surface area, does not make any sense. And that is what creates a massive environmental impact. So we have to smarten up when it comes to farming more generally, whether neonics are involved or not. We've now thrown away any principle of integrated pest management by saying, well, we're just going to treat everything all the time. And that, in my books and in the opinion of a lot of people, because there's a growing consensus here about, from independent scientists, not the hired guns that the companies hire all the time, but independent scientists agree that we have serious problems with neonics, one, and the way we use pesticides, two. And this goes all the way up to the United Nations. I mean, everybody agrees, we're not doing it right. So in conclusion, and we can pass on to questions. I like to drag this quote out because in my how many years have I been involved? 45 years of pesticide involvement. I had never seen a statement like that. So some desk assessor at the EPA in 2008 said, if we register thiamethoxam, I predict structural and functional changes of aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. Well, whoa. That to me was like a quite an interesting statement. I'd never seen anything like that in any assessment before. Unfortunately, it now appears that it was correct. And of course, it was completely ignored by the registration authorities, even though it came from their own ranks. What I show in the report is that the field data that we have is completely concordant with a properly constructed risk assessment. And the problem is the risk assessment has not been properly constructed, and then they don't look at the field data. So a weight of evidence doesn't exist, and the assessment is wrong. So if you approach it from the weight of evidence point of view, and you objectively look at the lab studies, you construct a risk assessment that makes sense, not using the lowest of two toxicity values and pretending that it protects all birds, you find that, in fact, it's very concordant. And, we could have predicted this. We could have predicted the problem. We did. In fact, one EPA staffer in 2008 did predict the problem. We have a problem, both in the aquatic and in terrestrial environment. So that lends me to conclude that currently the North American regulators are completely failing in their mandate. They're constructing risk assessments that are flawed, and they're ignoring weight of evidence, and they're ignoring the scientific consensus from independent scientists, societies, and whatnot. So neonics, if things continue as they are now, will continue to negatively affect birds and the ecosystems on which they rely. So I'll stop there, and Hardy, we can take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre. And real quick before we do that, I do have one more quick section about some of the policy recommendations and implications that are going on right now. So currently there are some states that have decided to also, thank you so much, Pierre. That was phenomenal. I apologize for not thanking you first. This is an incredible amount of work, and we are so glad to have had you come and share your expertise and write this amazing report. And to underscore everything that he said about where the regulatory process is kind of failing, there are states that have started to take a bit of action on this. So this is a table from the report. So that's why it's a little bit grainy in here. It's a screenshot out of there. As of the writing and publishing of our 2023 report, there were 10 states that had made neonicotinoids restricted use pesticides, which means you had to have a license in order to apply them, or had restricted them in a few other ways. That's only 10 out of 50. And then there are some other states that have gone a little bit further. Nebraska, unfortunately, had a large-scale poisoning incident in the town of Meade, Nebraska, because some neonicotinoid corn seed was refined into ethanol, and the waste product of that process was then stored in an open field where it leached for years. It contaminated soil and water, and actually the University of Nebraska at Lincoln had almost every single bee in their study apiaries die from this contamination, which then led to the state passing a law that governed how neonicotinoid seeds can be used after they after the growing season has passed. And this is another instance of all of these loopholes that surround neonicotinoids. This isn't even talking about their use in a field. This is talking about what happens after the growing season with seed that was not used, because there are not currently very stringent disposal measures that are required for neonics. New York State has the Birds and Bees Protection Act, hopefully heading to Governor Hochul's desk this fall, which will talk about which would actually restrict the use of neonic coatings on certain crops starting in the year, I believe it's 2027. And so there'd be plenty of time for growers to transition. And then California actually also has a bill that is directing the Department of Pesticide Regulation to specifically investigate the agricultural and non-agricultural uses of neonics and what happens there. And then past that, there's another really creative approach that's been taken in the provinces of Ontario and Quebec in Canada with seed treatments. And this is something that I think the US really should pay attention to. It is written in French, so Pierre's able to read all of this. They basically changed it in Ontario and Quebec to where if you wanted to use a neonic coating on corn, or in Ontario on corn or soy seeds, you needed a prescription from an agronomist to say, yes, we believe that based on what you're planting and where you're planting it, a neonic coating is required. This is the translation taken directly from the report. There are hardly any retail sales of seeds coated with neonics. And when they did their assessments, only 0.5% of areas would be planted with corn coated with neonics, compared to 100% of acres of corn in that province in 2015. And soybeans went from 50% of acres down to virtually zero. And this is not banning them legislatively. This is just requiring their prophylactic prescription. It's not needed in the vast majority of cases. There's also a fabulous tool that's provided by the U.S. Geological Survey, their water quality assessment maps, which use survey data to map out where and how pesticides are used across the country. This project is currently scheduled to be drastically scaled back, even though it's a very important regulatory tool. So that is something that we would love to see a little more noise made about and a little more attention paid to. And then in terms of federal policy right now, there are some really fabulous bills from Congressman Earl Blumenauer, the Support America's Pollinators Act, Saving America's Pollinators Act. I apologize, everybody. And then there's also the Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act, which is recently bicameral. Both of these aim at not only helping pollinators, but also people and communities that are affected by pesticide use. And then the biggest area that I think we're going to see a lot of action in is actually supporting funding for the EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, specifically their consultation branches. These are literally the people reviewing the chemicals, deciding what species may be affected, and then making those recommendations, and hopefully using some of the data and the recommendations that Pierre's prepared in this report. So these are definitely areas of action. We would love to see support for these. On the other side, some legislation to watch, especially because this is a farm bill year. So we are going to see a lot of things shoehorned into different places. There's the Ending Agricultural Trade Suppression Act and the Agricultural Labeling Uniformity Act. Both of these would codify federal preemption of pesticides, meaning that in most cases, you would have to make a pesticide restriction at least the state level or above, which means that localities could no longer protect themselves as easily from certain pesticide uses or protect species at a county or city level. There are a lot of laws that would be affected by these, according to a study from Harvard University. And then a very recent one, the CROP Act, great acronym, communication regarding, that should say oversight, not office, the oversight of pesticides. And this would actually extend the period of use for canceled pesticides to at least one growing season past, when federal regulators would say that these chemicals can no longer be used. This is intensely problematic and something that we are certainly going to be keeping our eyes on. So with that, I will say thank you, everyone, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If anyone has a question, please use the raise hand function, and then we also have some questions over here in the chat, so we can get to those as well. So we'll start. If anyone would like to raise their hand, does anyone have a question? And if not, I can read one out of the chat. And if anyone needs to run, I know it's the top of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us. The full recording will be emailed out afterwards. All right, I don't see any raised hands, so I will start with, it was mentioned earlier that you are not proposing a total elimination of neonics. That is something I said. What general approaches are you recommending to their usage to reduce existence in the environment? Pierre, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, I can start with that. I mean, I think there's a place for highly effective systemic insecticide like a neonic. There are some pests that are, I can think, there's some pests with very staggered emergence, for instance, difficult to get at, hidden under scales of plants, whatnot, where, perhaps a good systemic insecticide could actually replace 2 or 3 or 4 sprays. Which used to be the case with some highly toxic things like parathion and whatnot. So yeah, I think that there's definitely room for it. Where what you don't want, and this comes back to the cost benefit, is the entire surface, agronomic surface area, agricultural surface area being treated with neonics when the benefit only applies to a small part. And if you look at seed treatment, there was even an EPA analysis that said it's not cost effective in soy. Yet it's still registered for soy. There have been a lot of academic studies showing that, even in corn, maybe in forget if it's southeast or southwest, perhaps in a few small areas, yeah, maybe the rest of the time, no. So what we have here with neonics is largely a function of the fact that pesticide manufacturers have bought the seed distribution system. So essentially there is no, there's no longer in control. And in fact, that was a big problem in Quebec and Ontario when they started saying, well, you'll need to get permission to use neonics. Farmers couldn't get untreated seeds because the companies, they sell you the seed and they're coated whether you like it or not. It's been shown in some papers that a lot of farmers don't even know they're applying a pesticide when they're putting in their seed. So that to me is, we're taking what could be a good specialty insecticide used for hard to get at pests, and we are just going for, well, because that's, it's economics, right? When companies put a molecule out there, their entire goal is to sell as much of it. They're looking for volume. They're not looking to improve agriculture. They're not looking to improve the welfare of farmers. They're looking to sell as much chemical as fast as possible before other companies start coming up with generics when their patent expires. And that's always the case. So here they found the perfect way of doing it. We'll put it on every seed that we sell. And that's the problem. That's where a competent regulator should say, wait a minute. We're on the cost benefit. And surely, given the environmental cost, well, first, the regulator has to realize that there is a large environmental cost here that they've been underestimating. And 2, that their cost benefit completely gone out the window, and they need to restrict neonics to where they're absolutely essential. There are no easy IPM solutions to get around that particular problem. There are no softer chemicals that could be used to get around that problem. And down the list to we'll have to use a neonic here, knowing that it's going to have an impact, but at least it'll be on a smaller geographical area.
Great, thank you, Pierre. And that feeds into another question that we got asking about how growers might be obtaining seeds that are untreated, because that can be a difficult issue, which is what you were alluding to. And are there any ideas for how farmers can be best supported in states that want to ban neonic treated seeds? And I'll say from a policy angle, one thing that Pierre was talking about is how a lot of the seed dealers and pesticide companies are basically one and the same, and they're using the seeds as a great vehicle to continue moving product. However, depending on the crop, depending on the specific seed that you're ordering, it's treated at a different point in the process. For instance, soybeans are usually treated on site, either at the seed dealer or on the farm itself. Corn can be treated a little bit further up in the production process. And so sometimes you can request an untreated seed. Of course, there are organic seed options that you can look into, and sometimes you can even make a specific request of your seed dealer or the manufacturer that you're working with. There are companies across the US that do offer this service. And do we have any ideas for how farmers can be best supported in states that want to ban neonic treated seeds? There was a really great study commissioned by the EPA in 2014, which asked the question, is there an economic value to widespread treatment of soybean seeds with neonics? And the answer from the EPA itself was that no, it is not an economically significant or an economically viable solution. And as has been shown with Canada, in the vast majority of cases of these large-scale monocultures where this is being used, they're not usually needed. There are plenty of other alternatives in terms of insecticides. And I'll also say that every state that I've seen and that I've researched that has any kind of a neonic restriction in it, or especially in the very, very few that have started to do a seed ban, it's included a long phase-in period, as well as a lot of different emergency authorizations or exceptions that are written in just in case there's some crazy super pest or something happens with the market where there's nothing else available. I've yet to see one come through that is going out of its way to victimize growers or really, completely turn off their ability to get these without giving them a long time to transition. But as we've seen in Europe, as we've seen in Canada, when it becomes an issue that the markets need to solve, the markets solve them. But in the meantime, until there's that pressure in the United States, there's no reason to make these adjustments, which is why I think that these adjustments are very, very important to start making. Also, our friend Sharon Salvaggio pointed out another great bill to watch is the Pollinator-Friendly Plant Labeling Act, Senate Bill 2199. Thank you for that, Sharon. Another question for you, Pierre, is, goodness, where was it? Oh, yeah, here we go. We rarely hear a plea of the impact of all these chemicals in aquatic species since the contaminated runoff is flowing into our streams, lakes, and rivers. Are there numbers regarding the decline of any aquatic species, and then how could that affect birds and other wildlife?
Yeah, as I pointed out in the presentation, there definitely are studies coming out showing declines and showing that these declines are directly related. And we certainly do know from the ecological literature, as well as the studies like the Holman study, that birds are being affected as a result of residues in water. I'll take there was another comment here that came out about forests, and it's true. Neonics are not just used in agriculture; they're actually used as vet drugs. So cities, through pet collars and shampoos and whatnot, are actually now increasingly important point sources of aquatic contamination, and that's something that also needs to be reckoned with. Yeah, they're used in forestry. There, the impact is really going to depend on how to use. In some cases, to use as tree injections. But even that, there's studies showing that after a tree injection, leaf loss and some of those leaves will fall on the water body, and through degradation, the neonics are released back in the aquatic environment. So there really is no free lunch when it comes to using a chemical that is as powerful as a neonic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Pierre. And we also had a question about why did some states decide to take these actions, the ones that have made neonics restricted use pesticides or passed other laws governing their use. That it's very much a state-by-state issue. We think it's fantastic that states are taking these steps. We very much support them. We've actually, as American Bird Conservancy, have co-sponsored pieces of legislation that do exactly this. Frankly, a lot of these issues could be, I won't say solved, but the effects could certainly be lessened or better understood if there was tighter regulation at the federal level. And so that is something that we really need to make sure that we are still pushing for, tighter regulation in the EPA on neonics. A big one, which Pierre alluded to, is that if a neonic is put on a seed, which is the most voluminous use of neonics, it is no longer considered a pesticide legally. It is now an exempt pesticide, which comes with its whole own set of challenges. And that is one of the things that has motivated a lot of states to take their own action, is because there is this missing level of regulation at the federal level. In terms of disposal of seeds, I think we're going to keep seeing bills about that, especially in seeds that are very heavy ethanol producers or that do a lot of corn processing. I think that we're also going to see a lot more pieces of legislation that are looking to prohibit the use of neonics on certain crop seeds within certain time periods, which again is a very common, very understandable reaction to have, but one that really could be addressed at other levels of government. But until they are, the states need to keep up on this action, and we're very, very grateful to see it. The other thing that's interesting about states that start to address this is that they're all doing it in very different ways. There was a bill in California this past year, which we were very big fans of. And basically, it was not a specific ban on chemicals or neonics. It didn't have any restrictive measures written into it. It simply said that a neonic used as a seed treatment, or any chemical used as a seed treatment, would have to be treated as a pesticide under all other existing state laws, meaning that these pesticides have to be regulated like every other pesticide in the state. And I think that that's a really creative and really interesting approach to take. And again, as Pierre said, there are certainly instances where strong insecticides are needed. However, neonics and the way that they have been so explosively used, so voluminously applied, and with such an absence of necessary regulation and species protection, it's just inexcusable at this point. We do have another question from our friend Peter Jenkins. Do we have good information on bird poisoning incidents that identify neonics as causative? And is there more that ABC and other bird groups can do to monitor and report bird poisoning generally? I'll answer that real quick, then I'll turn it over to you, Pierre. The EPA recently took a huge step, which we're thrilled to see. They released 10 years worth of incident data, just raw incident data. They've made that publicly transparent. This is the data that they refer to when they are proposing new mitigations or running incident reports. So that is certainly of interest to us, and we are going to be looking at that. The National Pesticide Information Center is another great outlet for that. We work with them. We talk with them about avian incident monitoring. And is there more that ABC and other bird groups can do? Report it. If there's any suspected poisoning of birds, if there's any weird instances, please make sure that you are telling your state and federal authorities about that. But going back to you, Pierre, the first part of the question was, do we have good information on bird poisoning incidents that identify neonics as causative?
Yeah, and not to throw a cold shower on what you were just saying, Hardy, but I will throw a cold shower on what you were saying. You're
Please
not
do.
going to get useful information out of the currently designed EPA reporting system. Some years ago, EPA decided to basically make reporting easier, and considering, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but if you've got less than 25 songbirds dead in a pile, then it's not really an incident worth reporting. It can be that could be combined with others. They've got the people who wrote those rules obviously knew nothing about finding carcasses in fields, which is difficult at best of times. As I mentioned, I spent most of my life looking at OPs and carbamates, some of which, like carbofuran, were exquisitely toxic and much more rapid in their action. And even then, it was actually very difficult to find carcasses in fields, even though we knew that we were losing birds by the millions as a result, for various reasons. Birds, if they had any time at all, would just go in and hide. Birds would be scavenged as soon as they dropped dead. It's very difficult to see mortality. Having said that, yes, and that's in the report. There are definitely incidents both here and here in the U.S. and in Europe that have reported mortality, always with imidacloprid, definitely more, as I mentioned, acutely toxic than clothianidin and thiamethoxam. I don't think I keep debating in my mind as to whether I'm more concerned about the acute effects or the indirect effects with neonics. And I think on the balance with neonics, I'm probably more concerned about the indirect effects through the impacts on insects. We're not going to see, as I mentioned, it's equivalent to other insecticides of middling toxicity, like acephate, like dimethoate. We're not going to see the level of mortality that we were seeing with the diazinon and with carbofuran, which really are the types of compounds where you have much of a hope of seeing frequent and repeated effects through any sort of warning system. I've written extensively on warning systems and their problems and their, the good sides and the bad sides. The other issue that we have, of course, with neonics is we don't have a good marker. So the chemical analysis of carcasses is very difficult and very expensive. With OPs and carbamates, for instance, we had already made physiological test in the form of cholinesterase inhibition that any high school student could actually run on a piece of filter paper or with a simple spectrophotometer. So there was an easy way to say, okay, that bird, which is now dead as a doornail, has been exposed, and in fact, the exposure level based on the brain cholinesterase looks like it's pretty high, and therefore it was probably responsible for the death. We don't have that one in the eggs, so it's going to be very difficult to tie bird mortality in fields anyway, unless you're really looking for it. In France, they did. So there's one paper that came out while imidacloprid was registered there at a rate that was perhaps slightly higher than in the U.S., although it did overlap with the rate that was being used in the U.S. And they had 100 kills of birds, which if anything shows that the seeds weren't avoided that well, because the company has been saying all along that coated seeds are avoided by birds. They're not avoided. It makes them sick. And if it makes them sick enough, then they can establish a link between that ingestion of the seed and the fact that they're sick, then they will stop eating it. So it's a race against time as to how many seeds are you going to take, and when are you going to say, I don't feel so well, I don't think I should eat anymore. And that depends on the bird, depends on the conditions of the bird, depends on how hungry they were, depends on the environmental conditions, depends on how many other food sources there are. So there's a huge amount of variation there. What I think I am showing in the report is that the potential for bird kills is definitely there, definitely for imidacloprid and acetamiprid. The potential for reproductive effects is definitely there for probably all the neonics.
Absolutely. And to your question about are the indirect effects worse or the direct effects worse? The fact that there are both indirect and direct effects and both are extraordinarily concerning is part of the issue as well. This is not a class of chemicals that only affects vertebrates and invertebrates in one way or another. There's such a wide range of cascading and direct effects that all stem from this single group of chemicals that goes largely unregulated. That's why we really need to pay attention to neonics and really heavily restrict them so much more.
And the aquatic side too. I mean, it really is the perfect storm.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of emerging evidence that aquatic insects are actually really important for birds, because they're actually more nutritious and than a lot of terrestrial insects, and a number of birds, including aerial insectivores, rely on emergent insects that had their larval forms in water, and the fact that those are impacted as well as the terrestrial insect component, and on top of that, with some of them you will be sick or will have difficulties with reproduction. It's kind of it's a 1-2-3 punch, really, when it comes to birds.
Absolutely. We had a question asking if ABC, American Bird Conservancy, has a position on when neonicotinoids are used in control of invasive insects such as emerald ash borer, and specifically this talked about hemlock woolly adelgid. There's also Asian citrus psyllid, and we don't have a policy up on the website, but I can tell you, because I'm the person at ABC right now who's commenting on a lot of these procedures, that we do always carve out in any pesticide comment that we're writing for specific targeted applications of pesticides for conservation purposes. And so in the Birds and Bees Protection Act in New York, which is the neonics on seed restricting bill that we're very supportive of, there is a specific section carving out the use of neonics by the Department of Environmental Conservation there for the treatment of, or for the combating of hemlock woolly adelgid. So yeah, we recognize that invasive species themselves are also a major threat to birds in North America and all biodiversity. And again, that is a very different use from when these chemicals are used on every seed of corn or soybeans or wheat or cotton, when they're on every single sugar beet seed that's going into the ground, every single potato piece that's being planted to spawn a new crop in certain states. It's really all about the scale that they're being used at and the knowledge with which they're being used and applied. One of the reasons why we're so thrilled to see neonicotinoids become restricted use pesticides in certain states, whereby I, as an unlicensed person when it comes to pesticides, I can no longer in those states go and buy them from a hardware store. I have to be a licensed and certified pesticide applicator. Is that in urban settings, suburban settings, pesticide use is normally anywhere from 2 to 40 times higher than is recommended on labels, because people aren't reading the labels before using these chemicals in their backyards. And so that just goes to show that when there's a specific targeted use in mind for a specific species, there are thresholds that we're trying to reach. That's very different from every single part of agriculture, or very widely commercially available to people who are not required to learn about the impacts of pesticide use. So we don't have a written statement on the website. We're actually working on one. But in cases where they're combating invasive species, we definitely recognize that there are cases where that can be very important. And then another question that came in from Sharon was talking about the JAM analysis, jeopardization or adverse modification of habitat for endangered species, that EPA did for neonics. And normally that responsibility would fall to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Are we worried about that process? Because it seems like EPA maybe stepped outside of their wheelhouse a little bit. And as we say in the report, and as we said in our technical comments, we do not feel like it was representative. We don't feel like all species that really were going to be potentially affected, adversely modified, jeopardized, were actually listed. And we've since said that to them. However, if it was left just to Fish and Wildlife to get it done, we understand that with staffing levels and prioritizations, it could have been years before we saw that jam analysis. So we're glad to have some analysis done rather than none at all. We do know that EPA worked with Fish and Wildlife specifically on the neonic one. However, I'm also not wild about the precedent that that sets where maybe Fish and Wildlife isn't necessarily consulted, or we don't have the most up-to-date data on where species are before making those predictions or making those calls. So we're glad to have some jam analysis that was done. And I think the biggest takeaway from that process is that there were well over 200 species that are threatened or endangered in the United States that were listed as jeopardized by current registered uses of neonics. That's bananas. That's an insanely high amount of species to be called for jeopardization. We feel like the birds were also very underrepresented and underprotected by those calls. We feel like there's a lot more species that should have been on that list. However, we are glad to see that an analysis was done and that was released to everyone, and that will be also part of the upcoming biological opinions on neonics that are coming out. Pierre, do you have anything to add to that?
No, nothing to add. I'm just scrolling through some of the other questions that came in. One I addressed partially, I think, already in my presentation, which was, is there any evidence that birds will rebound after we get rid of, assuming we get rid of neonics? As I mentioned, the most likely place for that to happen is Europe, and we'll probably know in 10 years' time, because that's probably how long it will take to establish a good trend line. At current time, even though neonics haven't been used for 2 or 3 or 4 years, depending on the country, there is still massive exposure to neonics. They actually don't know where it's coming from. There's enough neonic stored, if you wish, in the environment that there continues to be exposure and a large number of bird species that have been looked at. So that's a little bit problematic because it means that we're not yet at the time when you want to reset the clock and say, okay, well, how are birds doing from here on out? And as I say, it'll probably be 10 years before we have any information, and it will depend on what you replace the neonics with. They're not the only damaging pesticides that are out there, for sure. Another question came out, work on secondary poisoning or accumulation. So these compounds are not likely. If these compounds accumulated, they could probably be legislated on their sort of not World Health, but UN regulations on hazardous chemicals that are sort of persistent and bioaccumulatory and toxic. They would actually fit the bill as, you know, but they don't bioaccumulate per se. They're quite water soluble, so they're metabolized fairly readily. Now, that does not mean that they don't present a risk to raptors. If I eat a bunch of treated seed in a hurry because I'm hungry and I have this sort of huge load in my gut, in my crop, then any raptor that comes along and ingests the whole thing will essentially runs a risk of poisoning, but it's not real secondary poisoning, which is generally meant to be when the materials are distributed through the tissues, as they are with organochlorines, for instance. So yes and no. Yes, you could get secondary mortality of raptor, but not for the same reasons that we had problems with DDT or other bioaccumulating compounds.
Great. Thank you so much, Pierre. And we are coming up on 3:30. And so I think that this is a good place to kind of wrap it up. Everyone, please feel free to reach out to me. We'll follow up with a recording. But Pierre, any closing thoughts for the group today?
Yeah, I hope that the message that we try and put through is clear. We're not, as Hardy said, I'm certainly not anti-pesticide. I think there's a place and a time for it. I think we need to be a lot smarter. I think, somebody was saying, well, about farmers being hard done by here. Well, if farmers, in my books, farmers are hard done by the fact that they don't have a choice when they farm as to whether they want to use treated seed or not. In a lot of cases, they don't even know they're applying a pesticide that's having a definite impact on their land, on their fields. So I think the farmers here are the victims of bad agriculture and a corporate policy that puts profit in front of the environment, certainly, and in front of need and human welfare.
Thank you. And I'm not going to be able to top that. So what I'll close with is this is a really pivotal moment in terms of pesticide policy in the US. And even though it doesn't always seem like the most exciting thing or the most direct connection to wildlife or human health, it is because of its ubiquity. We have an EPA that, even though we're not thrilled with a lot of the stuff that they're putting out, they're being very active. They're really putting in a genuine effort. We have a Fish and Wildlife Service that is really working hard to consult with the EPA on a lot of species. We certainly feel like there is room for improvement, and we don't hesitate to remind them of that and give constructive criticism. But we're very, very glad to be active in this space. We're so glad to have so many people interested in this work. We're happy to answer any questions. And now more than ever is a time to really reduce the amount of neonics getting into our environment. And so I will end with a quote from Pierre, which is in the last part of our report. It's actually how we wrap the whole thing up. Now, even more than in 2013, we see a very strong case for cancellation of all but the most essential uses of neonics. You know, Pierre, you couldn't have said it better yourself, and you are the one who said it. So thank you, everyone, so much for joining us. Please feel free to follow up with me with any questions, and have a great rest of your week.